What if the person you admire most is standing in the way of the person you were meant to become? Not because they hurt you, not because they failed you, but because you decided, somewhere along the way, that they were more than human, and you were less. Most people think hero worship is harmless. A little admiration, a little imitation, what's the damage? But here is the uncomfortable truth. Every time you place someone above you, on a pedestal built from your own hope and hunger, you are quietly signing a contract. And the terms of that contract are brutal. You get to admire, they get to be perfect, and you get to stay small. This is not a video about self-esteem slogans. This is about something deeper, something almost invisible, something that shapes your relationships, your ambition, and your sense of self long before you're even aware it's happening. It is the mechanism of the pedestal, and until you understand it, you will keep building them, one person at a time, one disappointment at a time. There is a reason this pattern feels so natural. It goes back to childhood, to the first time you looked up, quite literally, at a parent, a teacher, an older sibling, and needed them to be bigger than you, wiser than you, safer than you. That need was real. It kept you alive. But most people never stop looking up. They simply change the face on the pedestal. First it's a parent, then a teacher, then a mentor, a celebrity, a partner, a guru, a boss. The face changes. The posture of smallness does not. By the end of this, you will see why the moment you stop putting people on pedestals is not a moment of loss. It is the moment you finally come home to yourself. And you will understand exactly how that shift happens, because it is not an accident. It is a process, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an ending that almost nobody expects. Let's start with the part nobody wants to admit. The pedestal is never really about the person standing on it. Think about the first person you ever idolized. Maybe it was a parent who seemed to have all the answers. Maybe it was an older student at school who moved through the world with an ease you couldn't imagine having yourself. You watched them. You studied them. Some part of you thought, if I could just be like them, I'd finally be safe, finally be enough. But here's what almost nobody notices in that moment. You weren't actually seeing them. You were seeing a shape built out of everything you felt you lacked. Their confidence became a mirror for your doubt. Their calm became a mirror for your anxiety. Their success became a mirror for your fear of failure. The pedestal wasn't a tribute to who they were. It was a monument to what you believed you weren't. This is the part that stings, so let it sting for a second, because it needs to. When you idealize someone, you are not loving them, you are using them. Using them to hold a piece of yourself you were too afraid to hold on your own. There's a story that captures this with painful clarity. In the late 1950s, a young psychiatric patient came to see a therapist who would go on to become one of the most influential minds of the 20th century, Carl Jung. This patient described, in almost worshipful tones, a mentor from years earlier, a man of extraordinary wisdom, unshakable calm, someone who seemed to have transcended ordinary human weakness. The patient spoke of him the way people speak of saints. Jung listened for a long while, and then he asked a question that the patient had clearly never been asked before. What part of yourself do you refuse to see that you needed him to carry for you? The patient was stunned into silence, because the truth was simple and devastating. The mentor wasn't actually calm. He was quiet, and the patient had filled that quiet with the calm he himself was desperate to feel. The mentor wasn't actually wise. He listened well, and the patient had filled that listening with all the wisdom he was terrified he didn't have. This is the mechanism Jung would spend decades mapping. He called it projection, the unconscious habit of taking pieces of yourself, usually the pieces you haven't developed yet, or the pieces you're ashamed of, and placing them onto someone else. Not because they possess those qualities in the extreme you imagine, but because it is easier to admire a quality in someone else than to do the terrifying work of building it in yourself. Here's where things get uncomfortable. If pedestals are built from projection, then every person you idolize is in some sense a hologram, real on the outside, empty in the middle, built almost entirely from your own imagination. And that explains something that confuses almost everyone at some point in their life. Why getting close to someone you idolize so often ends in disappointment. You've felt this before, haven't you? The teacher who turned out to be petty in private. The public figure whose interviews revealed insecurity instead of brilliance. The friend's older sibling who, up close, was just a person. Anxious, flawed, ordinary. Most people interpret this as betrayal. They let me down. But that's only half the story. The truth is stranger, and honestly, more liberating. They never had the greatness you assigned them. You gave it to them. And when reality couldn't sustain the myth collapsed. Not because they changed, but because proximity finally let you see what was always true. This is where the second problem begins, and it's the one nobody warns you about. When the pedestal falls, most people don't learn the lesson. They simply go looking for the next pedestal. Think about how many times this cycle has repeated in your life, or in the life of someone you know. A person outgrows one mentor, feels the sting of disillusionment, and within a year has found a new hero to worship with the exact same intensity. A new guru, a new relationship where the partner is different from everyone else. A new boss who is finally the visionary they've been waiting for. The names change. The pattern doesn't. Why? Because the actual problem was never about finding the right person to admire. The actual problem is the unfilled space inside you that keeps demanding to be filled by someone else, because you haven't yet dared to fill it yourself. This is where Jung's most radical idea enters the picture, and it is the idea this entire video is built around. He called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you've borrowed yourself to be from other people. Individuation doesn't happen by finding better heroes. It happens by taking back every piece of yourself you've been projecting outward, and learning to hold those pieces on your own. That sounds abstract, so let's make it real. Picture a woman in her early 30s. We'll call her the composite of 100 people who've lived this exact story, who spent her 20s attaching herself to a series of mentors at work. Each one, in her mind, was brilliant. Each one, she believed, held the missing piece of confidence she needed to finally trust her own judgment. She followed their advice with near religious devotion. She deferred her own instincts every single time theirs conflicted with her own, and each time, eventually, cracks appeared. One mentor turned out to be driven more by ego than wisdom. Another gave advice that, in hindsight, was simply wrong, confidently wrong, the most dangerous kind. Each collapse left her more disillusioned and, strangely, more desperate for the next pedestal to climb onto someone else. It wasn't until her fifth mentor, a woman who, refreshingly, refused the role, that something shifted. This mentor would not answer questions with certainty. Instead, she kept asking a single, maddening question back. What do you think? At first, this felt like abandonment. She wanted answers, not questions. But over months, something began to change. She started noticing that she already had opinions, good ones. She had simply never trusted them enough to voice them, because she'd spent a decade handing that trust to someone standing above her. The moment that changed everything wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. She was in a meeting, disagreeing, internally, with a senior figure everyone in the room deferred to without question. And for the first time, instead of assuming she must be wrong because he was the expert, she paused and asked herself a different question. What if I'm not wrong? What if he's just confident, and I've been mistaking his confidence for correctness this whole time? She spoke up. She was right, and something in her chest loosened that had been tight for years. This is the moment we're building toward, the day you stop putting people on pedestals. And notice something crucial about how it happened. It wasn't triggered by hatred of the people she'd once idolized. It wasn't cynicism. It was the simple, quiet reclaiming of her own judgment. That's the whole secret. and almost nobody expects it to be this undramatic. But here's where things become interesting, because taking your projections back is not comfortable. It's actually one of the more painful psychological processes a person goes through, and here's why. As long as your confidence lives in someone else, you never have to risk it. If they're wrong, it's their failure, not yours. If they fail, you can quietly distance yourself and go find someone new to admire. But the moment you take that confidence back into your own hands, you also take back the risk. Now, if you're wrong, it's yours. Now, if you fail, there's no one else to blame and no pedestal to hide behind. This is exactly why so many people avoid this process for their entire lives. Staying small feels safer than standing exposed. Admiring someone else's greatness costs nothing. Building your own costs everything you have. But here's the twist that changes the entire emotional weight of this conversation. The cost of staying small is not actually smaller. It only feels smaller in the short term. Over a lifetime, the cost of never reclaiming your own judgment, your own confidence, your own wisdom is enormous. It's a slow erosion of a life that was always meant to be yours, spent instead in service of admiring lives that belonged to someone else. Let's go deeper into why this happens with the specific people closest to us. Because pedestals aren't just built for mentors and celebrities. They're built inside relationships, inside families, inside marriages. And this is where the pattern becomes the most painful and the most disguised. Consider a man who spent 15 years of marriage believing his wife was, in his words, the strong one. He built his entire identity around being the supportive partner to someone stronger than himself. It felt noble. It felt like love. But underneath it was something else entirely, a quiet abdication of his own strength, handed over piece by piece, year by year, until he genuinely believed he didn't have any of his own left. When the marriage began to strain under the weight of that imbalance, because no person, however strong, can carry two people's strength forever, he described the sensation as watching a statue crack. Not her, himself. The pedestal he'd built for her had been standing on a foundation of his own unclaimed capability the entire time. This is the part almost nobody talks about. Putting someone on a pedestal isn't just unfair to you. It's a quiet burden on them too. They didn't ask to carry your unclaimed strength. They didn't sign up to be infallible. And the resentment that so often creeps into relationships where one partner idealizes the other isn't really about love fading. It's about the exhaustion of being asked, silently, endlessly, to be more than human. So here's the lesson underneath the lesson. And it's one that reshapes how you'll see every relationship in your life from this point forward. Real intimacy is only possible between two people standing on the ground, not one on a pedestal and one looking up, because looking up is not love. It's dependency wearing love's clothing. Now you might be thinking, surely some admiration is healthy. Surely it's fine to respect people, to learn from them, to be inspired by their example. And you'd be right. This isn't a call to tear everyone down, to become cynical, to stop believing anyone deserves respect. That would just be another kind of imbalance. Replacing worship with contempt, which is really just the same pattern wearing a different mask. The difference between healthy admiration and a pedestal is simple, and once you see it, you'll never unsee it. Admiration says, I see something valuable in you, and I want to build something similar in myself. A pedestal says, you have something I could never have, so I'll just watch you have it instead. One is an invitation to grow. The other is a life sentence of spectating. This distinction matters more than it seems, because it changes how you relate to everyone from this point forward. Teachers, leaders, parents, partners, even public figures you'll never meet. You can respect someone's discipline without believing you're incapable of your own. You can admire someone's talent without believing yours doesn't exist. You can learn from someone's wisdom without surrendering your right to disagree with them. There's another story worth telling here, because it shows how far this pattern can travel when it goes unexamined. all the way into how entire societies behave, not just individuals. Throughout history, the most devastating cults of personality have relied on precisely this mechanism, scaled up to a terrifying degree. A leader is presented not as a person, but as an answer, someone who has solved what the follower could never solve alone. And the follower, hungry for the relief of not having to carry that weight themselves, hands over their judgment willingly, sometimes gratefully. The tragedy is never that the leader was uniquely evil. The tragedy is that ordinary human weakness, the same weakness that makes any of us want a mentor to hand certainty to, was exploited at scale. This is not to say every mentor is a manipulator, far from it. Most people you've idolized in your life were simply ordinary humans who never asked to be placed on the pedestal you built. But it does reveal something important. The habit of pedestal building isn't a small personal quirk. It's one of the most consequential patterns in the human psyche, and learning to dismantle it in your own life is not just self-improvement. It's a kind of quiet resistance against every force in the world that benefits from your smallness. So let's talk about how the dismantling actually happens. Because knowing the problem is not the same as knowing the solution, and this is where most self-help conversations stop short. They tell you to believe in yourself as if that's a switch you can flip. It isn't. Reclaiming your projections is a process, and it has real, practical steps. The first step is noticing the pedestal while you're standing in front of it. This sounds obvious, but almost nobody does it in the moment, because idealization feels like admiration, not distortion. The next time you catch yourself thinking, "I could never do what they do," pause. Ask the question that changed everything for the woman in the story we told earlier. What part of myself am I refusing to claim right now? The second step is testing your own judgment in small, low-stakes moments before you test it in the big ones. You don't reclaim a lifetime of projected confidence in one dramatic confrontation. You reclaim it in 100 small moments, disagreeing quietly with an expert opinion you actually have evidence against, trusting your own taste even when someone more credentialed disagrees, making a small decision without asking for outside validation first. The third step, and this is the one people resist the most, is tolerating the discomfort of being wrong on your own terms. This is crucial, so let it land. Part of why the pedestal feels so safe is that it outsources the pain of failure. If you take your judgment back, you will at some point be wrong. And you have to be willing to survive that without immediately climbing back onto someone else's pedestal for safety. Being wrong on your own terms and surviving it is the single most transformative experience in this entire process, because it proves something no amount of admiration ever could, that you can trust yourself, not because you're infallible, but because you can handle the consequences either way. Before we get to that grief, there's one more place this pattern hides, and it might be the most costly of all, because it doesn't just shape how you see other people. It quietly caps how far you let yourself go. Think about ambition for a moment. Not the loud kind, the kind people perform on social media, but the quiet, private ambition you rarely say out loud, even to yourself. The book you might write, the business you might start, the skill you've always suspected you could master, if you actually gave it everything. Notice what happens in your mind when you imagine reaching for that thing. For most people, a face appears, someone who already did it better, someone whose existence seems to prove that the ambition was always a little unrealistic for someone like you. This is the pedestal operating in its most insidious form, not as admiration, but as a ceiling. Because if that person up there has already claimed brilliant, you quietly assign yourself competent. If they've claimed visionary, you settle for practical. You don't even experience this as settling. It feels like realism, it feels like maturity, but it's neither. It's projection working in reverse, carving away your own ambition to protect the myth you built around someone else. There's a telling story about a young composer who spent years refusing to finish a single piece of original music. convinced that anything he wrote would be a pale imitation of the composers he revered. He could analyze their work for hours, note every technical choice, defend their genius passionately to anyone who'd listen. What he couldn't do was sit down and write 16 bars of his own without abandoning them in disgust. His teacher finally asked him something simple. Do you love their music, or do you use their music to avoid finding out what yours sounds like? He didn't have an answer that day. But the question followed him for years, the way the right question always does, until one afternoon he sat down, wrote something unmistakably imperfect, and finished it anyway. He said later that finishing it, flaws and all, taught him more than a decade of worshipful analysis ever had. This is the trap of comparing your unfinished self to someone else's finished pedestal. You are always comparing your rough draft to their highlight reel, your private doubt to their public polish, and the comparison is rigged from the start, because you're not actually competing with a person. You're competing with a curated myth, and myths always win. The way out is not to stop admiring talent. It's to separate admiration from permission. You do not need someone to be lesser than you in order for you to attempt greatness. You do not need to dethrone anyone to finally sit down and write your 16 bars. The pedestal was never actually blocking your path. It only felt that way because you'd convinced yourself that greatness was a limited resource, that someone else's brilliance used up the only available share. It doesn't work that way, and somewhere inside you, you've probably always known that. Knowing it and living as if it's true are two very different things, and this is where the living finally begins. There's a strange kind of grief that shows up during this process, and it deserves to be named, because if you don't expect it, it can feel like something has gone wrong. As you start dismantling old pedestals, you may find yourself mourning them, mourning the comfort of believing someone else had it all figured out, mourning the relief of not having to be the one responsible. This grief is not a sign of failure. It's a sign the process is working. You cannot let go of a comfort you never admitted you were holding on to. And here's the moment where the emotional weight of everything we've discussed starts to shift towards something lighter. Because this is not, in the end, a story about loss. It's a story about return. Think back to that patient in Jung's office, stunned into silence by a single question. What happened to him afterward is worth knowing, because it's the same thing that happens to almost everyone who finally does this work. He didn't stop respecting his mentor. He simply stopped needing him to be more than human. And in that release, something unexpected happened. He found he actually liked his mentor more, not less, because now he could see him clearly, not as a myth built from his own longing, but as a real, flawed, specific person who had genuinely helped him in ways that didn't require pretending he was superhuman to matter. This is the paradox almost nobody expects. And it might be the most important insight in this entire video. Taking someone off a pedestal doesn't destroy your relationship with them. It's often the first time you actually get to have a real one. Worship keeps people at a distance, frozen in an image. Seeing someone clearly, flaws and all, is the only way real closeness is possible. The same is true, even more powerfully, in your relationship with yourself. Because here's the final piece of this puzzle, the one that ties everything together. Every pedestal you've ever built for someone else was really a pedestal you refused to stand on yourself. And the day you stop putting other people on pedestals is, without exception, the same day you finally allow yourself to stand at your own height, not above anyone, not below anyone, just finally, fully, at eye level with your own life. This is not arrogance. It's not the inflated confidence of someone who now thinks they're better than everyone else. That would just be another kind of imbalance, another mask for the same old fear. This is something quieter and far more durable. It's the settled, unshowy knowledge that you don't need anyone else to be superhuman in order for you to feel safe. That you can respect people without disappearing beside them. That you can be inspired without being erased. Picture what your life looks like on the other side of this shift. The mentors you once needed to have all the answers become simply people you enjoy learning from, without the crushing expectation that they be perfect. The partners you once needed to be stronger, then you become people. You build genuine strength alongside, shoulder to shoulder instead of looking up. The public figures you once envied from a distance become reminders of what's possible, not proof of what you lack. And the anxiety that used to live underneath all of it, the quiet, constant sense that everyone else has something you don't, begins slowly to dissolve. Not because you've become someone else, but because you've finally stopped outsourcing yourself to other people, one pedestal at a time. This is the work Jung spent his life pointing toward, though he never pretended it was easy, and neither should we. He wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The pedestals you build without realizing it are exactly that. Fate disguised as admiration, patterns repeating themselves until you're willing to look directly at them. So here is the final thought, the one worth carrying with you long after this video ends. The people you've idolized were never actually as large as you believed, and you were never actually as small. The gap between you was never real. It was built brick by brick, out of your own unclaimed potential, handed outward because it felt safer than holding it yourself. The day you stop putting people on pedestals is not the day you stop admiring anyone. It's the day you finally step off the ground you'd been kneeling on and stand up, not above anyone, just finally at last as yourself. If this changed the way you see the people you've admired, and maybe the way you see yourself, subscribe, because the next lesson digs even deeper into the parts of the mind you were never taught to examine.